Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ejaz Haider. Let's begin with the perception of India's smaller neighbors of India's foreign and security policies. India wants to project power and acquire hegemony within South and West Asia as well as the larger Southern Asian region. It believes that its size demands that. To this end, it also presents India a colonial administrative construct as a single entity through history. Nothing could be further from historical facts. India also has border and other disputes with all its neighbors. Sikkim was finally subsumed as an Indian state in 1973, and by 1975, the Sikkim parliament had voted to join India. Bhutan, a protected state, though not a protectorate like Sikkim, depends on aid from India and has no independent foreign policy, defense arrangements, and commerce. All three areas indicative of a state's sovereignty are controlled by India. Nepal has its own border disputes with India and recently issued official maps that show Kalapani and Susta as belonging to Nepal, a fact that was bitterly opposed and disputed and is bitterly opposed and disputed by India. Bangladesh is no different, and while Delhi and Dhaka managed to resolve the issue of enclaves and adverse possessions in 2015, it was a tedious process mostly dominated by India. India also supported Tamil separatism as it did East Pakistani separatism in 1971. India's support of Tamil separatists resulted in Sri Lanka facing a Tamil insurgency that lasted for nearly 3 decades and has left deep scars on the body politic of that country. India has similar disputes with Pakistan, at the center of which is the internationally recognized issue of Kashmiri's right to self-determination. India remains in illegal occupation of Jammu and Kashmir, and since 5th August 2019, has illegally annexed the territory in violation both of the UNSC resolutions as well as bilateral understandings. Since 5th May, its forces are locked in a standoff with People's Liberation Army of China in the disputed Ladakh region, and 3 days later in Nathula in Sikkim, the state India subsumes, as mentioned earlier. Indian analysts say India is prepared to assert itself. That would be in keeping with the belligerence we have seen on Narendra Modi's watch. India might also be drawing the wrong lessons from the 2017 Doklam standoff. The border is disputed, and while there's a line of actual control, there are also claim lines on both sides. The standoff has already reached a point where US President Donald Trump shot off an early morning tweet offering to mediate. Where does the situation stand, and how can smaller states in this region handle India's power projection is what we shall discuss today. And we are joined by Professor Rajiv Kumar, who is a professor at the University of Heidelberg. He served on the faculty of Kashmir University also from 1984 to 1990. We also have with us Mr. Einar Tangen, who is an analyst and joins us from Beijing. Let me begin with Professor Kumar here. Professor Kumar, I just gave a sense of the perception of India's small neighbors in terms of how they look at India's power projection. So let's first talk about that, and then we'll come to the PLA Indian Army standoff after we have discussed this.
Well, the basic point is that there are no two countries with contiguous borders who don't have some kind of issues. But here the question arises, there are these two fundamental factors. One is this, or actually there's just one fundamental factor, and that is the current right-wing nationalist Hindu government in India, and particularly with this prime minister who is completely drenched in hubris. And that's the basis of all problems. Ever since coming to power in 2014, and then getting even a bigger majority in 2019. So they think they have got some kind of license to, because there's no one country which can have problems with so many countries in their neighborhood at the same time.
Professor Kumar, with your permission, sir, let me check here. While I take your point that on Narendra Modi's watch, things have become even more complex, the fact is that India's power projection. Now, I talked about Sikkim, for instance. There was a certain status of Sikkim. during Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru's life. And after his death, we know, you know, way better than I do, what late Mrs. Gandhi did in order to sort of push Sikkim towards subsumption in India. And then, of course, in 1973, and then there was a lot of pressure on the parliament, and finally it became an Indian state. I talked about Bhutan. In 1971, Mrs. Gandhi wrote a letter to President Nixon invoking what we call the R2P, the right to protect, talking about the Bangladeshi, East Pakistani refugees, and went militarily against Pakistan. Then I talked about the Tamil insurgency. That was on the watch of the late Rajiv Gandhi. So what I'm saying is that there has been a consistent pattern in relation to the neighbors. And of course, as I said, things have become compounded because of the current RSS-inspired government of Mr. Modi.
Well, yes, in the history of the nations, there are always problems. And it has been happening with India also. But never has it happened simultaneously with so many countries as we are seeing now.
Okay.
Because we can always go back and what happened in 1973 when Sikkim was annexed, or for that matter, we can always argue with what happened in 1971. But now it's a kind of like what we see now is some kind of unilateral. So India is assuming that it's unilaterally it has become a hegemonic power, so it can dominate the entire region. But I think they might have read too much about what you refer to as this Doklam incident. So, and once they start stirring up their pot with China, so that might not go very well.
Okay. Let me pull in Einar Tangen here. Mr. Tangen, give me your reading of the situation. I've talked about various inflection points in India's foreign policy and its push for power projection. But then I also talked about the Doklam 2017 standoff. There have been earlier incidents along the line of actual control. There are also the claim lines, as I said, between both sides. Would you agree with Professor Kumar when he says that on Narendra Modi's watch, India has become more belligerent, or do you think this has been a pattern?
Well, I would agree with you. I mean, there have been several incidents in the past. It's quite clear that India guards what it sees as its areas of influence. And with a rising China, this has become extremely sensitive. Unfortunately, sometimes, as in Nepal, what we can talk about as the most current example, they saw India kind of encroaching. Now, the irony there, of course, is that Nepal and India have had very cordial relations. They're, in essence, a protectorate. But with this strongman nationalist government, you have two leaders, both of them who are under political pressure. And it seems that a lot of these map drawing and statements and road building, they can be pretty much calculated to elicit hostile responses from both sides. In terms of the India-China situation, the Chinese believe that it was India who was being aggressive. There was a statement by a senior leader of the government minister in their parliament saying that he would dedicate himself to getting this land back. They had a statement from the army chief who said very clearly that he was looking to rebalance because he thought that Pakistan and China were threats. This, along with the road, has convinced China that perhaps there's a danger that there would be some sort of, some sort of incident along this route. The thing here is that, we're confronted with a world pandemic. Why are we arguing about arid flat lands that really have no economic value whatsoever other than perhaps control of water rights and things like this? It seems unbelievable to me that at this time this is the major concern. We need a world that's pulling together, putting aside differences and territorial disputes, and saying, how do we help each other? Because this pandemic will not be over until all 8 billion people on this earth are given an antiviral. And until that time, you're going to continue to have economic damage. And I don't think any kind of posturing or theatrics on anybody's side is going to help.
So there is a lot of, Mr. Tangen, about CPEC also and broadly the Belt and Road Initiative. But China had very clearly invited India to be part of that.
In 2013, Xi Jinping said that India and China, if they worked together, could rewrite history, that there's a real feeling amongst many people that this is the Asian century. But if these countries are split by, this kind of colonial era gamesmanship where they pit countries against each other for their own benefit, neither India nor China nor Pakistan nor any of the groups in there, countries surrounding that area will benefit. This is an age-old game. We can go back and start blaming the British, I believe. If you start looking around the world, not many of the, quote, colonies that they created and brought civilization to are doing very well. They were the ones who drew these kind of arbitrary lines or encouraged the kind of situations that we have currently by virtue of the way that they try to divide up these states in furtherance of their own economic goals.
Absolutely. But let me pull up Professor Kumar. Professor Kumar, Mr. Tangen is talking about, of course, the colonial period and the legacy of colonialism, which has left so many scars, so many disputes. But in a way, we have also come of age. We have to live in this region. There is no way that Pakistan or China or India can up and move somewhere else. And therefore, maturity would perhaps demand that we begin to look at things anew. We begin to look at a cooperative framework rather than approach things in a very Hobbesian kind of manner. Do you think that is even possible with India under Narendra Modi? I talked about what they did with Jammu and Kashmir. There's a cartographic aggression. So they talked about Nepal's issuance of maps. But what about the maps that India has issued where it's shown the liberated territories of Azad Kashmir and Gilgit-Baltistan as part of India, where Indian government high officials have talked about reclaiming territory from Azad Kashmir and Gilgit-Baltistan. So I think there's perhaps need to shed the baggage of history and begin to look at things anew.
Well, I completely agree with that. But I am very skeptic anything happening under Narendra Modi's government. Because this is very personal for me, what they did in Kashmir. When Narendra Modi won big in 2019, and there was sudden a perception in Kashmir, so probably they could deal with Narendra, or he would find some solution. And what he did instead, he just completely decimated the basic structure of the state. He just put entire population of that state under lockdown for months and months, and they are still under virtual lockdown. They still don't have access to outside world freely. And then they don't tolerate any dissent. Any dissent is completely annihilated without any resort to any courts or anything else. So, and then I may add one point here. It might be that this dispute with China might be, because it looks like that Narendra Modi and his government, they hitched themselves very closely with Trump presidency.
Correct.
So that's a factor that cannot be ignored.
That's something that Mr. Tangen also implicitly mentioned, the sort of, the gamesmanship. But I think that is something which is on the cards now, unfortunately. But before I get to that, Professor Kumar, I need to ask you something as a proud Kashmiri and also as a Hindu. Do you find it abominable for the RSS government in Delhi to look at Kashmir in terms of Muslims and non-Muslims?
Oh, not only Kashmir, they are looking at the entire Muslim population of India that way. So what they did in Kashmir, they are trying to repeat it at the entire on the entire country. So in that is the context for this what they call as this CA, this Citizenship Amendment Act, and what they subsequently intend to do with this national registers and everything. So their basic aim is to disenfranchise Muslims in India.
Okay. Let me go, Mr. Tangen. Mr. Tangen, let me just quickly, give you a gist of some of the points that are being discussed in the Indian media with reference to the current standoff at the line of actual control. One is that China is determined to expand influence in South Asia. So essentially, this means that India is a check on China. And they also talk about Nepal there, which I find ironic because Nepal actually sent official notes to China also, not just to India. Then there is a point about Beijing smarting from being forced to return to the status quo in the Doklam Plateau in 2017, which I mentioned earlier also. Then there is a bit about their health minister, Harsh Vardhan's election as chairman of the World Health Organization and his demand that the WHO be investigated in relation to the handling of the COVID-19 crisis in China. And then there's the thing about the Chinese building border infrastructure for decades, and now since India has begun to do this, China has been forced on the back foot, and so on and so forth. There are other points also, but I think you get the sort of gist of what I'm saying. So given this kind of approach, where do you see the standoff heading? I mean, the Chinese foreign ministry has said that the situation is under control and the rest of it, and China is trying to play it down, but there's a lot of noise in India.
Well, quite frankly, I don't think China is anxious for any kind of war, especially in its backyard. As you rightly pointed out, the Belt and Road Initiative and RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which, if it goes through, will be the largest trade pact in the world after WTO. These are the main points. China is looking for economic advancement, not territorial advancement. A few arid plateaus and mountains are not going to do China any good. There are, of course, nationalistic feelings about this, but I completely agree with your earlier statement. I think it's time for all parties to move on, to figure out a way in which they can sit down at the table and say, what is past is past. We can't change that. This land doesn't, if you lift up the rock, it doesn't say it belongs to China or Pakistan or India or anybody. It's time to just figure out how you can live together peacefully and, your peoples can, in fact, enjoy some sort of prosperity. With more and more money in the world going into arms, it's not helping the situation. When arms are created, they're going to be used. And at this point, it's more important, especially given the economic circumstances associated with COVID-19 and this pandemic, for them to pull together. So completely agree with you. It's time to put aside all the past differences and act like adults and sit around the table and figure out how to get this done. I think China was trying to do that with the SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, bringing both Pakistan and India in. They thought that this would be a forum where everybody, Russia, China, all the rest, could discuss areas of mutual interest, safety, and prosperity. But so far, that has not worked.
Absolutely. Thank you. That was Einar Tangen speaking with us. Professor Kumar, so Kashmir, and you very rightly said that it's personal for you. What are the prospects here? I mean, so, COVID-19 has become the big story. It has actually provided space to the Modi government to act with great impunity and with a lot of, the coercive apparatus of the state. But there are constant gunfights, people being injured, dying, and the rest of it. How do we put the story out to the world?
Well, when it comes to Kashmir, they never needed any cover. So they had been doing all along with total impunity. Yes, now this pandemic has given them greater freedom to do whatever they want to do. And actually, this pandemic situation, they used it more to crush this agitation against the Citizenship Amendment Act that was going on in Delhi and other places. But in Kashmir, they are doing what they have been doing all along.
Absolutely.
So they, they did...
Stay with me, Professor Kumar. Stay with me. I'm also joined by MD Kamaruzzaman, who's a journalist and covers Bangladesh for international media. Since you talked about CAA, Mr. Kamaruzzaman, Bangladesh, of all the countries in the region, frankly, I mean, the one country that has probably the most pro-Delhi government, that's in Bangladesh. And yet, on the issue of the Citizenship Amendment Act and also the National Citizens Register, there's been friction between Bangladesh and India. Give us a reading of how Bangladesh looks at this, because the Prime Minister, Hasina Wajid herself, is on the record in an interview saying, we really don't know why India did this.
You have said well, and it's a good question. Actually, most of the Bangladeshi people who are concerned about the situation in India-occupied Kashmir and other parts of the country during the recent unrest that was occurred based on the new Citizenship Act. Actually, most of the Bangladeshi people, they want to see a very stable India as well as a very stable border between India and Bangladesh. In case of other big neighbor, which is related to India, China has a great influence in Bangladesh in terms of business, and India has a political influence here. And actually, these big two countries, they have the intention to establish their supremacy, or in other words, their hegemony in the small countries of this region. But the strategies of both countries are totally different. Actually, China wants to establish its supremacy here based on economy and other business activities. They have huge involvement in most of the big projects here. But the role of India is totally different. Actually, India has not so huge capability economically like China. That's why India always want to establish its supremacy here through politically, and that's why in internal politics, Indian influence here is more than China. And in the recent unrest
Mr.
in
Kamaruzzaman,
India...
Mr. Kamaruzzaman, sorry to interject, I'm also running out of time. So one quick question. Why do you think the smaller states in South Asia, all of them, right to the last, I mean, even Nepal, which is so close to India, everyone looks at India as a state that wants to project power, to dominate. Why do you think there is this feeling?
This is a time of globalization, and every states and normal people are also very aware about the development across the world, and emancipation or act freely. This is a very much inherent. This is a very much natural characteristics of every state. And in the Asian region, all countries they now want to do business freely. They want to raise their voice.
Doing business is very different. Doing business is very different from trying to dominate the countries. But thank you so much, MD Kamaruzzaman. I've run out of time. Thank you also to Professor Rajiv, Kumar. We shall take a short break and return to discuss Hezbollah's rejection, in fact, Lebanon's rejection of a U.S. demand to empower the UN peacekeeping mission in southern Lebanon. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. From a discussion of India's hegemonic designs, we move to Lebanon. The head of the Lebanese group Hezbollah on Tuesday rejected a U.S. request to empower a UN peacekeeping force patrolling the border with Israel. Hezbollah chief Hassan Nasrallah spoke ahead of a UN Security Council vote this summer to renew the mandate of the UN interim force in Lebanon, UNIFIL. Lebanon has refused to change UNIFIL's mission, but Israel wants it to have the right to raid and search private properties, and the Americans are pressuring Lebanon on this matter. This is what Nasrallah said. UNIFIL is supposed to implement UN Resolution 1701, which ended the 2006 Second Lebanon War between Israel and Hezbollah. The resolution calls for all armed groups besides the Lebanese military to be removed from southern Lebanon in the area south of the country's Litani River. The current issue with the mandate has been simmering for some time. UNIFIL has indicated that the constraints of its mandate prevent it from being able to fully investigate Israel's claims because of the peacekeepers' inability to enter private property. To discuss this further, joined by Leila Hatoum, who's a journalist based in Beirut. We also have with us Meguerditchian, who is a television journalist, joins us from Paris. Thank you so much. Let's begin with Leila here. Leila, it's Israeli demand, and obviously the US is backing it, but it seems to me that Lebanon is not going to bite.
Well, definitely. I mean, expanding UNIFIL's mandate in Lebanon, basically from a peacekeeping that actually is more station facilities and maintain peace on the ground, to an armed, army that would intervene with weapons at any point inside Lebanese territories in favor of the Israelis. This is how the Hezbollah sees it. Is not acceptable. And since Hezbollah has its own MPs in the parliament, it has former ministers, and has a majority on the ground in terms of southern territories, which is basically closer to the borders of occupied Palestine, they have kind of a resentment when it comes to changing UNIFIL's mandate. I don't see UNIFIL's mandate changing anytime soon, because that's a decision that should be taken in the United Nations Security Council. And on that level, of course, there's a veto at any point, be it China, be it Russia, any of the allies of Iran, who are basically the supporters and financiers of Hezbollah.
So tell me and my viewers that is this just Hassan Nasrallah's and Hezbollah's approach, or is it Lebanon's approach not to have the UNIFIL mandate changed? I mean, if you're asking for raids into private property and the rest of it, then you've got policing functions, enforcement functions that actually is a strike at Lebanon's sovereignty per se.
This question has been ongoing for years, not now, since 1978 and forward, since the creation of UNIFIL's peacekeeping operation in Lebanon. But the idea is that the Lebanese are split, but the majority is split between basically let's give them more powers or not. However, the majority of the Lebanese are against empowering any foreign elements on the ground, be it United Nations troops or anybody else, in terms of holding weapons and maintaining security and policing the area, when we do have our own Lebanese army, which is now spread all across the southern Litani River and areas. And there's also as well, you have the internal security forces. So why would we need somebody else to go and police Lebanese territories? That's a breach of Lebanese sovereignty. This is how the Lebanese see it, especially Lebanese living in southern area, in southern Lebanon. So for me, I mean, I live most of the time between South Lebanon and Beirut, and I do listen to people all the time. They are very skeptic when it comes to expanding the mandate of UNIFIL to be policing these areas, when you do have a legitimate army, that's the Lebanese army, that's spread over here. We've seen the Lebanese army spread since 2007 and up. That's following the 2006 Israeli aggression on Lebanon and following the 1701 UN Security Council resolutions issuance. You do have internal security forces manning the ground as well. And you do have Lebanese over here who are still in favor of seeing their own government taking action on its own territories rather than having foreign troops doing that for them.
Okay. Van, give me yours of the situation. But before that, let me be the devil's advocate here. So one of the arguments, for instance, the Americans would advance, and perhaps the Israelis would advance too, is that the Lebanese army, and that's what Leila is talking about, the Lebanese army simply is not in a position to control Hezbollah fighters. So that's the, I am being the devil's advocate, but also give me your reading of the situation.
Ejaz, we've moved a lot since 2005, after the 2006 July war with Israel. The Lebanese army didn't even have the right to be deployed in South Lebanon. The Lebanese army was deployed to South Lebanon at the same time as the UN Security Council Resolution 1701 was put in place. The Lebanese army was deployed. It's been 15 years almost they are there. But the Lebanese army is kind of like a mediator in a role of mediating between the UNIFIL forces who are trying to enforce 1701 on the ground and the residents and Hezbollah militants on the other hand. So the Lebanese army's role is to kind of make sure there are no incidents, that this 1701, at least in a larger picture, at least as a figure, it looks like it's working. But in reality, the 1701 actually is only being partly implemented. The part of keeping Israel safe is being implemented, but the part about how Lebanon, South Lebanon is safe, that is not being implemented, which is big. A part of the 1701 resolution calls for the deployment of additional peacekeeping forces in South Lebanon to ensure peace between Lebanon and Israel. But the second part, an integral part that a lot of people forget, the 1701 resolution calls for the implementation, full implementation of a prior resolution, which is even more important than 1701, which is 1559. The 1559 resolution calls for the disarmament of all non-state groups in Lebanon and the respect of Lebanon's sovereignty and the withdrawal of all foreign forces from the country. So with the absence of that, the implementation of 1559, 1701 can never be fully implemented. And it's sad, but the truth, the reality of the matter is thousands of UN peacekeeping forces in Lebanon are the last remaining tourists and guests in our country, in Lebanon. A lot of so many Lebanese, especially in South Lebanon, so many businesses, so many Lebanese in South Lebanon, benefit and do business on a daily basis with these peacekeeping forces that who are over there as guests, and even Hezbollah.
So an entire economy has come up because of the UNIFIL. But Leila, you want to say something, I guess, with reference to what Van said about the earlier resolution and what the demand of that resolution was.
Everybody mentions 1559 and everybody mentions 1701, but everybody keeps forgetting that in 1701, the United Nations said that there's a continued Israeli occupation of Lebanese territory. That's the northern part of the town of Ghajar. The Lebanese town of Ghajar is under Israeli occupation according to the United Nations itself. And in the implementation of 1701, there's a report that came from the United Nations a year after 1701 was issued, and it said the continued Israeli presence, military presence in the northern part of the Lebanese town of Ghajar constitutes a threat to peace in the area. So the idea is that the United Nations says that there's an occupation to the land. You cannot implement 1559 in terms of disarming people from, basically taking people's arms when those people are basically fighting an occupation, supposedly, when under international law it says if your land is occupied, you are entitled to hold arms and fight the occupation, irrespective if your government is against you or with you. And that was basically issued because of Charles de Gaulle and the Vichy government. The French government during Charles de Gaulle's time was against the French resistance, and it was pro the Nazi occupation of France. The same situation happens over here. You cannot implement 1559 when the United Nations itself is telling you that there's an occupied Lebanese territory that the Israelis continue to take over by force and by arms. So you have to be very careful when it comes to saying we want to implement this resolution and forget other resolutions and other international laws. I'm not defending anybody over here. I'm just stating the law as it is. Really, violations of Lebanese territorial, maritime, and airspace sovereignty on a daily basis that the United Nations interim forces in Lebanon, UNIFIL, continue to monitor and document and send to the Security Council on a daily basis. So there's a continued breach by the Israelis to 1701. They've never implemented it. So they cannot ask the Lebanese to implement 1701 when they themselves are not implementing it.
Okay, let me take back to Van. Yes, Van. So if facts are selected and if the UN is going to do certain things, which you also said, with reference to Israeli security, and not do the rest, then how can you ask people to disarm?
It's not easy. It's not easy at all. The United Nations Security Council, just as the previous, my colleague Leila, if I'm not mistaken, forgive me, she mentioned there is a chance that other Security Council members would veto any American demand to modify the UN Security Council Resolution 1701. So the UN itself is an image, is a parallel image of what is actually going on between Lebanon and Israel and the UN resolutions. The Lebanese say the Israelis are not respecting the UN resolutions. The Israelis say that the Lebanese are not respecting it. But from the way I see it, from the way it is, from the way the reality is on the ground, is that the Israelis are currently happy with the situation. They have made sure that the Lebanese armed forces are deployed in South Lebanon. You have thousands of peacekeepers by the Israeli border. So in a way, they have assurances. But this itself pushed Hezbollah further into Lebanon, further into the core of the Lebanese politics. And since this resolution was passed, Hezbollah took a more active role in Lebanese politics. So
is that a good thing or thing?
Of course, in a way, it's a good thing. At the end of the day, Hezbollah is a Lebanese political party, whether it's considered a terrorist group abroad or it's a militant group in Lebanon. At the end of the day, it's a political party, and it has to get integrated within the Lebanese political system. At some point,
no, well, one of the counterarguments, Van, can be that this kind of creates a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde kind of character for the party or the group.
Well, it happened. It's kind of working in other countries. There are other countries in the world where armed groups were integrated, and through a national pact, they moved on. What this national pact could mean for Lebanon, it's to be seen. We don't know yet. But the situation remains critical today because the Israelis are making sure that everywhere else Hezbollah is put to check. But in Lebanon, Hezbollah's increasing role, Hezbollah's bigger role every year, and Iran's influence in the country is leaving Lebanon the only place where a very devastating war could start at any moment. So many reports have been written this year about it, and there are real concerns that a war could be started on behalf of Iran if Iran is further isolated in the world.
Okay, interesting. I'm also running out of time, so back to Leila here. Leila, do you agree with what Van is saying with reference to the Iranian influence and Hezbollah's politicization and the possibility of some kind of conflict?
Let's be very clear over here. I mean, Iran has influence in Lebanon through its arms like Hezbollah. And there are other countries that have influence in this country also via their own embassies over there. So it's not only one country that's pushing for things on the ground in Lebanon. However, when it comes to war, the way I see it, the Israelis are also pushing for war, but in terms of like they're threatening to take over and annex further Palestinian lands in the West Bank and in Golan Heights and in the Jordan River. That could cause friction as well. That may escalate and spill over to Lebanon and other countries. It's not basically Iran that's pushing for it. It's also Israel calling for it. And whoever is pushing for that basically is the one who's benefiting. And the way I see it, it's only basically arms dealers and bigger countries, not the smaller countries over here.
Arms dealers and bigger countries certainly don't have time to actually discuss what's happening in Israel politically after a long deadlock, because that's also important. We run out of time. Thank you so much. That was Leila, Hatoum, Van, Meguerditchian speaking with us on the Lebanese situation. This is all from Indus Special tonight. We shall see you tomorrow at the same time for latest updates. You can follow us on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.